Fjord on the western coast of Norway. 30 men on an open ship bound for Iceland. They have dried fish, weapons, timber, tools. What they do not have enough of is the one thing that decides if any of them make it alive. Water. A man who rows needs at least 3 liters of water a day. 30 men, 14 days if storms hit. That is 1,200 liters of fresh water, stored in barrels, that start rotting from the inside within days. When those barrels run low, nothing around them but ocean. Not a mouthful safe to swallow. Viking crews sailed this route for 3 centuries. Storms, rough seas, navigation errors. The sagas describe all of it. But running out of drinking water? Almost never mentioned. They built a system that kept them alive on open ocean, frozen ground, and through winters where nothing flowed for months. And the last piece of it, the part nobody expects, is still powering a capital city today. But the water problem did not belong to the ocean alone. Think about what an average Norse farm needed every single day. A man doing hard labor burns through 4 liters. Women and children, at least 2. But people were not the only ones drinking. A dairy cow puts away 40 to 50 liters a day, and cattle were not optional. They produced the milk that became butter, cheese, and an entire food preservation system. A modest farm of 50 people with 20 cattle, a dozen sheep, and a handful of goats. The daily water demand crosses 1,000 liters easily. In summer, rivers handled this. In deep winter, those same rivers turned to stone. Rainfall dropped to nearly nothing. Daylight shrank to 4 or 5 hours across Scandinavia and Iceland. A January morning in Norway starts dark and ends dark. Everything between your farm and the nearest water source is frozen solid. Every liter had to be earned. And here is what makes the Viking achievement hit different. In 1740, Commodore George Anson of the British Royal Navy set out on a voyage around the world. With 1,955 men, he returned with 145. 4 died from enemy fire, the rest from disease, most of it caused by contaminated water and diet. On his flagship, HMS Centurion, there were stretches where only 8 men could stand on their feet. This was not the Viking Age. This was the 18th century, 700 years later. The Vikings had cracked this problem centuries before. Not with rum, not with luck, with a system. Everything on a Viking ship sat exposed to the air. No sealed cargo hold. No compartments below deck. Water went into 2 types of containers, and the choice between them shows how carefully these crews thought ahead. On wider cargo vessels called Norse, oak barrels were standard. Each stave was split along the grain with axes and wedges, never sawn. Because split wood keeps its natural fiber intact and resists leaking. The staves were shaped, bent with heat, and bound with iron hoops. Seams were sealed with pine tar. A full barrel weighed roughly 70 kilograms. On a longship built for speed, that weight added up fast. So longship crews turned to the buker, a bag stitched from treated goat skin. Lighter, flexible enough to squeeze beneath rowing benches. Less likely to crack when the hull twisted in rough seas. The trade-off was taste. Saga-era Icelanders were not shy about complaining, but stored water, no matter the container, goes bad. The real reason Viking crews survived was not better barrels. It was a route strategy so precise it turned the entire North Atlantic into a system of freshwater refills. Anyone who has spent time on a small boat in open water knows the instinct. You do not cross long stretches unless you have to. You watch the coast. You plan your stops. When you find fresh water, you fill everything you own. The distances confirm this. Norway to the Shetland Islands, roughly 165 nautical miles, about 28 hours of sailing. Shetland to the Faroe Islands, 161 miles, 27 hours. Faroe to Iceland, 230 miles, around 38 hours. Even the longest open ocean crossings covered 700 to 800 miles and took 5 to 6 days. A modern sailor retracing the Viking route in 2016 confirmed it. No more than 6 days at sea between landfalls, ever. That changes the water math completely. A ship never needed to carry 2 weeks of water. It needed enough for 6 days at most. Every beaching was a reset. Some researchers argue this route pattern was mainly about safe navigation. Others believe freshwater resupply drove the route choices, that Viking expansion literally followed drinkable water. Both readings hold up. A Viking vessel drew barely 1 meter of water. The crew could ride a tide straight onto any beach, any river mouth, any gravel shore. Woolen sails treated with animal fat could channel rain into open containers when angled right. And when rain fell during a landing, they collected that too. The water problem at sea was not solved with one trick. It was solved with a system, every piece supporting the next. Now it gets counterintuitive. The most dangerous liquid on a Viking ship was the one that looked cleanest. Plain water. Sitting in a barrel, it turned into a breeding ground for bacteria within days. Green, cloudy, genuinely hazardous. Fermented drinks did not carry this risk, and the Vikings loaded them in quantity, not for pleasure, for survival. Ale production starts with boiling, and the way Vikings boiled water tells you something about their engineering instincts. They heated stones in a hearth fire until the rocks were almost glowing, then dropped them into wooden troughs filled with water. The thermal shock brought the liquid to a rapid boil. No need for metal pots, no need to hold a wooden vessel over open flame. Just stone, fire, and physics. That sustained heat killed virtually every pathogen in the water. The ale that followed was, in effect, sterilized hydration. No brewer knew the word microbiology. They just knew crews drinking ale got sick less often. Good enough reason to keep brewing, but ale was only part of the answer. The real revelation is Misa. When Scandinavian settlers made skyr, the thick fermented dairy food they carried to Iceland around 874 AD, a liquid remained after the solids were separated. That liquid, whey, was never treated as waste. It became the most widely consumed daily drink in Icelandic history. The standard recipe had its own name, tolftablenda, meaning the 12 blend. Mixed 1 part Misa with 11 parts water. The acidity dropped the pH low enough to stop bacterial growth cold. Tangy, light, easy to drink. Islanders called it an unmatched thirst quencher for centuries. Norse settlers eventually carried this drink to Orkney and Shetland. It survived there under the local name Bland and appeared in Scots dictionaries for generations. The Stung farmstead in southern Iceland was buried by a volcanic eruption in 1104, sometimes called the Pompeii of Iceland. When excavated, large whey storage vats sat in the main living space, not tucked in a corner. Central, daily access, hydration infrastructure at the heart of the home. And the cycle behind it was ruthlessly efficient. One dairy cow produced milk. That milk became skyr, dense and high in protein. The leftover Misa became the household drink and doubled as a meat preservative. One animal fed the family, hydrated the family, preserved the food supply. Nothing thrown away, everything accounted for. You pay a premium today for a bottle of probiotic kombucha or electrolyte water. The Vikings produced something nutritionally comparable, 1,000 years before anyone printed the word probiotic on a label. Imagine you are choosing where to build a farm in 9th century Denmark. You need harbor access for trade, defensible ground, fertile soil. But before any of that, you need to answer one question. Where is the water? Get this wrong and nothing else matters. Your cattle die first, then your crops, then your family. Hedeby, the largest Viking trading center in Scandinavia, shows what getting it right looked like. Roughly 1,500 people at its peak. Archaeologists found a network of timber-lined wells spread across the settlement, drainage channels between buildings, wooden plank walkways over muddy ground, a town that built water into its foundations from the start. And Hedeby was not alone. Ribe, Denmark's oldest town, had 8th century wells built into its original layout. London did not build its first organized water supply until the 13th century. That system, called the conduit, piped spring water into the city center. Hedeby had a functioning well network 300 years earlier. Excavations in York, England, revealed something even more striking about Viking-era ingenuity. 29 wells were lined with the staves of recycled shipping barrels, large casks 2.5 meters tall, cut open and fitted into the ground as ready-made well walls. Oak bottoms, pine and yew hoops repurposed from maritime trade into permanent water infrastructure. Same materials, completely different second life. Excavations in Trondheim, Norway, put daily reality in sharp focus. Very few private homes had their own wells. Most people carried water from shared sources by hand every day. No pump, no pipe, just a vessel and the walk. What separated Viking well builders from random diggers was method. They read the landscape. Marshy ground meant a high water table. Certain plants only grew where moisture was constant. The wells were lined with interlocking timber or fitted stone, porous enough for groundwater to seep in, tight enough to prevent collapse. A properly built Viking well refilled itself continuously. Winter sharpened every problem. Rivers froze. Lakes vanished under thick ice. Snow covered everything. But snow is not water until you convert it. That conversion costs energy. The most direct method was ice harvesting, cracking through frozen rivers with iron tools to reach liquid water underneath. The ice layer insulated the water below, keeping it from freezing solid in all but the worst cold. Hard, repetitive, daily work, but reliable. Snow melting used a technique that should sound familiar by now. Heated stones from the hearth fire, buried in packed snow inside wooden troughs. The same method used to boil water for ale. Same technology, different problem. One process gave them fermented drinking ale. The other gave them liquid water from frozen ground. Vikings did not invent dozens of separate solutions. They found one principle and applied it everywhere. Livestock made winter even harder. Dehydrated cattle produced less milk, which meant less skyr, less misa, less of everything the family ran on. 6 months of daily ice breaking, snow collecting, and careful rationing. Quiet work that never stopped. Iceland offered something no other Norse territory had: geothermal springs, hundreds of them scattered across volcanic zones. Water rising from the ground already hot, available year-round, immune to winter. The name Reykjavik itself means smoky bay in Old Norse, after the steam engulfer Arnarson saw, rising when he arrived around 874. But here is the part that makes you stop. Despite naming his new settlement after those steaming springs, Ingolfur built his actual farm 3.5 kilometers away from the nearest one. Geothermal researcher Ingvar Fridleifsson found zero correlation between hot spring locations and early farm sites across Iceland. Ingolfur chose a good boat landing beach over convenient hot water. For a seafaring people, harbor access beat a warm bath every time. Laugavegur, today one of Reykjavik's busiest shopping streets, takes its name from the route women walked carrying laundry to the hot springs in Laugardalur Valley. Wash Road, kilometers on foot each way just to reach water warm enough for cleaning. One last thing about Ingolfur and that steam he saw rising from the ground. He named the bay after it, but walked away from it. A practical man making a practical choice. What he could not have known is that the resource he dismissed would become the most valuable infrastructure his settlement ever had. Today, Reykjavik heats 95% of its buildings with geothermal energy. Hot water piped directly from the same volcanic sources that produced the steam Ingolfur saw in 874. The city's entire heating grid runs on water that rises from the earth already hot. No fuel required. No emissions. No treatment plants. Think about that for a second. A Viking in the 9th century looked at steam rising from the ground and gave his settlement a name based on what he saw. 1,100 years later, 200,000 people live in that city, and their heating bills are among the lowest in Europe because of the same resource he noticed and walked past. Most infrastructure built 1,000 years ago is rubble. This one is still running, still heating homes, still proving that the most important engineering decisions are sometimes the ones nobody writes sagas about. Pull back far enough and something emerges that most Viking histories never touch. Every ship that crossed the North Atlantic carried a water plan. Every settlement sat on a reliable freshwater source. Every household that made it through an Icelandic winter ran a fermentation cycle, turning raw milk into food, drink, and preservative. Nobody wrote epic poems about water. Swords got the sagas. Sea battles got the glory. But water was underneath all of it. Always was. Today, over 2 billion people lack reliable access to safe drinking water. Modern desalination costs hundreds of millions of dollars. Purification systems depend on chemical supply chains and electrical grids. And communities still struggle. 1,000 years ago, a culture managed this from Scandinavia to North America, with wells lined using recycled barrel staves. With fermentation knowledge passed from mother to daughter, with ships built to reach freshwater shores, and with a heating resource spotted from a boat by a man who did not even stop for it. That still powers a capital city. They did not conquer water. They worked with it, read the land, raid the coast, read the seasons, and built systems around what they found. The wells still hold water. The fermentation still works. The geothermal grid still runs. And that quietly may be the most Viking thing of all.